he traveled with me for 3 days, and I grew to trust him, sent him on errands. And then the third night out, he pulled out a gun and shot me in the head 4 times. And that was traumatic.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Because the past doesn't exist, but we carry it with us in our memory system.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Leading Below the Surface podcast. I'm your host, LaTonya Wilkins. Today's guest, what he's going to share, it's not going to be limited to coaches. It's also around human beings. And what is that topic? Well, today we're going to be talking about trauma-centered coaching. Again, and not just for coaching. What I will say is, as when I talk about leading below the surface, it's not just about below the surface leadership, it's about below the surface interactions. And so how could we be a little bit more trauma informed? And so let me tell you a little about this guest. I got very excited when I met him. So as many of you know, I was at the International Coaching Federation conference this year in San Diego, and Change Coaches had a table. And so it was really amazing to have that table and have all these people just come up to you, ask you questions about your business, ask me questions, purchase leading below the surface, all that stuff. And Lion was one of those people that came up to me, and we ended up having a conversation about one of his coach training programs, which is all around trauma-informed coaching. So we started chatting, and I believe in Kismet. I believe in all those things. And as I was telling Lion, like I meet every single guest before I have them on. Sometimes it's virtually, but usually I'm following the person like for a while, or I meet them and they have the vibe, and I'm like, okay, that's a good vibe for the show. And so Lion, a little bit about him is I know he runs this coach training program. I know he does a lot of other things. I'm going to let him introduce himself in a minute. But again, we're going to be talking all about trauma-informed practices today. So if you are someone that can use this, whether you're a coach, a therapist, just a human being who wants to relate to others, this episode is going to be for you. So welcome, Lion. What did I miss about your introduction?
Well, it was a beautiful introduction, so let's dive in. I don't think you missed anything.
Great. So I do want to say, just really quickly, this is like a fun thing. So one of the things I've commented on, and you made a little bit of a joke about it earlier about vanity and your name being Lion. And so I would love to know if you would be open to sharing, how did you get this name? No one's ever going to forget your name. So it's, and are you a Leo? That's the next question I have. You are a Leo. Yeah. Oh my God, I was joking. And you really are a Leo. Okay, go ahead.
My best and fastest joke is that my parents gave me an assumed name. They assumed I would like it when I grew up, and I didn't. So I changed it. That's probably the easiest way to describe it. There's a longer story that involves a school I attended in the mountains of Colorado called the Adventure Trails Survival School and Brain Laboratory. And part of the training was to find a medicine name apart from the city you came from, to find your true self. And so my teacher gave me the assignment, go find your medicine name. Take a walk in the woods. And I was walking in the woods going, I don't know what a medicine name means. I'm a 19-year-old kid from Denver. I don't know from nothing about a medicine name. And as I was walking through the woods with this question in mind, I heard lion. And I went, lion? I don't know anything about lions. They're in the jungle. They're in the zoo, But I felt like if that was my potential, it was certainly dormant. And so I called myself Sleeping Lion. And so that was my medicine name, and it changed over the years as I helped during this teach that class until I just became Lion. So I grew into it is the short answer.
Tell us a little bit about like your background and how you got into coaching.
The most important thing is that I've been a student of consciousness and the human mind and psychology since I was a teenager. In fact, I was quite a young teenager when I started getting interested, and it was because I felt separate and alone. And other people, I didn't know how to relate to other people. I was kind of socially awkward. And so I was an observer, and I was observing other kids and thinking they seem to be normal. I'm clearly not normal. So I want to figure out what's wrong with me so that I can be normal. And fortunately, after 50 years of study and practice, I never became normal. So that's my answer to that question. So normality is highly overblown, but I did become myself. And that's my goal with my students and my coachees is to help them become more and more themselves.
So when did you kind of get into this? Was it recently? Have you been doing this for quite some time?
After a couple of failed entrepreneurial ventures after college, first of all, I got my degree from the University of Colorado in consciousness studies in 1975. And as far as I know, it was the first degree granted in that field because I made it up at the time. But then nobody was hiring people with degrees in consciousness. So I had to become an entrepreneur. And then a strange thing happened to me and I ended up becoming a headhunter. And that was my first career for 25 years, working with corporations to find people for them, executives and salespeople, that kind of thing. And then when the dot bomb happened and that business just went away, a friend of mine, I didn't know what to do. A friend of mine said, why don't you become a coach? And I said, I don't know anything about coaching. And she said, sure you do. You've been coaching executives for 25 years and you've done all this self-development work. So I don't want to coach anymore. So I'm going to give you my clients. And I went, okay. And that's how I got started coaching is I was handed a bunch of clients that she had been coaching. So, and that really fit. Suddenly I felt like I was doing exactly what I was designed for 25 years ago.
So you became a coach before it was well known, before like the general population was really ready for coaches. It's like therapists being a therapist before people were really ready for therapists.
Right. It was very.
What have been your experiences with trauma and what made you kind of want to do trauma work?
First of all, the search for consciousness is endless. And I took more than 100 workshops and trainings over the decades in order to get to know myself, connect, become a better person, all those reasons for self-development. My childhood was fairly normal, upper middle class, parents that didn't talk to each other much, the kind of the normal neurotic family. But after I graduated from college, I didn't know what to do. I became a salesman and I was selling things to stores on the road for about a year and a half. And one day I was 26 years old and I picked up a guy whose car had broken down in the middle of the desert. And he traveled with me for 3 days. And I grew to trust him, sent him on errands. And then the third night out, he pulled out a gun and shot me in the head 4 times. And that was traumatic.
Oh, wow. Wow. Do you feel comfortable talking a little bit more about that and what happened after that?
I'm often asked about this because it is a dramatic story and obviously I survived, so it's okay to talk about. In fact, the story's been published widely and a short film was made and won Best Film at a film festival based on my story. I want to keep this tight because I know we have a short amount of time. My story is available on my website and I direct people there. So he decided to kill me. I pulled out a gun, shot me 4 times. Two of the bullets hit me, 2 missed me by fractions of an inch. And I had a spiritual experience. I'll just shorten it down to that. I was out of body, looked down at the scene, knew I was going to die, prepared for death, and then I didn't die. So we ended up talking for 8 hours after the incident. I won't go into more detail because it's a very long story.
Right.
We did negotiate our way out of it. So I became a very good negotiator. He went his way, I went mine, went to the hospital, and they told me 2 bullets had grazed me, bounced off my skull. And I was not badly injured, but I did go through a near-death experience. So then I was confused for a while, going, why did this happen? I'm a nice guy. I was being a nice guy to this guy. And so there's a lot of internal questioning. And after about a month of kind of psychological recovery, I needed a job, and I got a job as a headhunter, which is kind of ironic after having my head hunted to become a headhunter. So that's the way I look at it backwards. But it was a great career for me for 25 years. I did not sustain any permanent damage, and it awakened me even further, got me even more interested in spirituality and consciousness. What is this thing? If I was out of my body and looking down at my body, and these are the big questions of life. So lots of people ask them, who am I really? What is my true self? How can I be the best person I can be? And so that was my quest.
Thank you for sharing that with everybody. And I'll put his website in the show notes as usual. So when you so you're telling me this story, and you're telling all of us this story, and then you have this near-death experience, and then you negotiating for 8 hours, and it's like a miracle that you didn't bleed out or anything like that, right? As you know, with gunshots, like trauma wounds, right? And then you went to go be a headhunter. So do you feel like your spirituality was on hiatus at that time?
Here's one way that I explain it. Most people, when they have a near-death experience, become spiritual after being very in the world. Like, wow, I'm spiritual. I was already a spiritual being, but I wasn't very grounded. I didn't have an understanding of business. I was just kind of on the road as a hippie salesman, or just having a time traveling around. So it actually grounded me. And I got into the world, into the corporate world, and I found my grounding. And so I then was able to be both spiritual and grounded at the same time. And that's the shift that occurred for me. Other people have different experiences, when they're near death.
Okay, so you were already spiritual, and so the job was just, you're like, I need to live. I'm going to find a job, and headhunting sounds interesting, so I'm going to do that job. I love that distinct, how you're making that distinction, because it doesn't always, like your job, like you could still be moving forward. Like when I think about my journey, like change coaches became, it was becoming way before it launched, right? It wasn't that I was just sitting around. It was like everything was confirmation that was the next step in my life. And sometimes that's what happens in like divine time, right? It's not like we think of everything in chronological like when I did the episode with Kayvon Tucker, if all of you want to go back, that was an amazing episode. But we were talking about some of those things where it's like nothing grows really fast. Like what grows fast? Like weeds, like viruses, cancers, like things don't grow. So it's like, yeah, I get it. Like, yeah, it's not going to be something that you decide tomorrow that you're going to be in the career that's your life's work, right?
And, the Greek word eudaimonia, which is what Aristotle said was the purpose of being human, eudaimonia. It's often translated as happiness, like our job is to be happy. But a better translation is flourishing. We're designed to flourish. Is to flourish. And flourishing, like you said, a flower flourishes over time, slowly, step by step. There's an old movie where the actor, who's a grumpy old man, takes a cane and starts beating the plants next to the sidewalk going, "Grow, damn you, grow." It's like there's a lot of that kind of hurry up and grow up. That's not helpful advice because it does have to unfold.
Did your coach training include trauma?
No, it didn't. My coach training was pretty standard in saying our job is to take people from where they are and move them to where they want to be. We work from the present to the future, and all coaching schools teach that same principle, that we don't deal with the past. The past is for psychotherapists and psychiatrists to work with. We work with the present and the future. I did research to find out why that was, because it didn't make any sense to me when I discovered it, because most of the things that were holding my clients back was stuff from the past. Old traumas, childhood wounds, limiting beliefs that they accumulated along the way, what a teacher told them when they were 5 years old, "You'll never amount to anything," or what their parents said, you're in the way. So those were the things that were stopping people from that forward movement. And when I looked through coaching, all of it was kind of like Band-Aids on cancer. Just think differently. Just do this, make a commitment, be accountable, clear your vision board and make it really distinct, pick reasonable goals, smart goals. And I realized that it didn't matter how much good advice I gave my clients, they were getting stuck. They would come back week after week, not having done the homework, not having done the work that I assigned to them or that they assigned to themselves. Because why? And when I started looking into that, I realized it was all stuff from the past, limiting beliefs, a childhood wound, all that stuff. And traumas were a big part of that. What happened in the past to cause you to be stuck now? And that became my primary question. So I researched it in depth, and I realized that all the things I had learned in self-development could be applied to coaching. And so I began using the tools and techniques for self-development, and suddenly my clients were flourishing because we were clearing the stuff in the way. And when you're walking up a mountain trail, if there's a tree in the way, you either turn around and go back, or you stop and meditate forever, or you climb over it in some way. You get past the barrier or the boundary condition. And so by looking into the past and understanding how the mind works, how it forms these limiting beliefs, how it forms wounds, and how it forms behaviors, then I was able to go in with a proper tool and unhook that old stuck place. And so trauma is a significant part of that, because we've learned in the last 20 years that there's big traumas like being beaten, small traumas like being neglected, and a wide range of traumas, all caused by our needs not getting met. So all of that psychology went into the development of the Clear Beliefs method of trauma-informed therapeutic coaching.
So it sounds like you kind of started getting some clients that were just kind of in a hamster wheel, right? And they weren't really solving their problems. And this is really important. I'm really glad you're talking about this, because I have found like myself in those loops, like I feel like I've had good coaches, but one of my first coaches, he was trying to coach me on the surface, and it was a career coach, and he was trying to help me get a job. And I was like, like, what was that, like 15 years ago? And now I'm like, wow, there's still traumas that I'm healing from. That one of them is like the trauma of like, opposite of you, I grew up very poor. I grew up very, I grew up very working class. And so I can get in my mindset. And when someone calls out a limiting belief, I'm like, okay, I guess that's one way to name it. I don't know if I would name it a limiting belief. Like, I do have limiting beliefs, but I don't know if I'd name that a limiting belief, maybe like a formative belief or something. But I do think there's other words for it. And I do understand what you're saying. And this is probably speaking to a lot of you folks that have had coaches or therapists that you feel like just don't get you. They don't see you as creative, resourceful, and whole. They don't see the whole of you. And they're using these judgmental terms. And when you say it, when you name that as judgmental, then they're like, oh, you got to suck it up. Oh, well, then you're never going to get through this. And, I'm seeing a lot of that, because a lot of people are calling themselves quote unquote coaches. And that's really not what coaching is. And so I do want to hear a couple of different things. So like when you say you want to hook this in their brain, I want to, if you could talk a little bit more about that and that process. And I also want to hear a little bit about, I'm sure you know a little bit about psychedelics and trauma, and like, do you know about that? You want to talk a little bit about that? And like, because I actually had someone on this podcast that talked a little bit about that, but she wasn't an expert in it. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. First of all, on unhooking that, which I haven't done any psychedelic treatments, but I hear that can really do that, like really quickly. I've talked to several people. I was at a performance last week, and he was talking about it because that's what his music is for. So maybe say more about that.
Well, that's a lot of topics.
That is a lot of topics. I know. I'm so curious right now. Okay, let's start with the unhooking, because I think I was conflating.
I'll try to streamline it for you. First of all, in order to understand this unhooking, you have to understand what are the hooks. How does the mind form? And what I realize is that most people think of beliefs as mental constructs. I believe in Santa Claus. I believe in less government or more government. That's a mental construct. That's a thought, a mental thought, and it's a conscious thought. But that's not the root of beliefs. The beliefs come from our experience. Growing up in poverty, things are traumatic. You don't have enough. Now it becomes I'm not enough, and you internalize the environment, and so that is a construct that comes from experience. Experience is multidimensional. You're right now, you're hearing and feeling and seeing and thinking, and you've got energy, an energy body, and you've got relationships, you've got an environment. All of these factors are part of your experience. And so when a belief is formed, I call it beliefs, other people call it schemas or maps of meaning, lots of words for it. But it's the construct that comes together to understand the world. because the world is confusing, especially to a child. And the child's trying to navigate in order to survive this complex, ever-changing environment. And so there's a thing called the patterning instinct, a book by that name by Jeremy Lent. Fantastic book. He talks about it historically. But we have this instinct to find patterns in the world and then identify them, grab onto them, and then use them to survive. And we become the brain is basically a gigantic predictive machine. It's always trying to predict what's going to happen next and what do I need to do to survive. If I do this, then that happens. If I do this, that happens. I don't want that to happen, so I'll do this instead. So we begin in the womb, actually, coming up with these understandings of the world. If your mother is in fear or in poverty or in anger or doesn't want to be pregnant, her thoughts and hormones are invading that baby in the womb. And the baby is forming their understanding of the world from those thoughts, feelings, and hormones. And so a baby could come out of the womb. We think of it as a blank slate, but it's not. We now know that the baby comes out with the understanding non-verbally that the world is a dangerous place. So that's the beginning of the foundation of who am I and how do I survive in the world. And then your parents start telling you who you are. Oh, your name's LaTonya. You're so cute. You're going to grow up to be a doctor. Isn't that wonderful? But we don't have enough money, so we can't give you what you need. So all these things are happening, and you as a child are putting them together to form your sense of self. And you can watch that happening in a baby who becomes 1 and 2 and 3 years old. Pretty soon they have a sense of self, and they've made it out of their environment and their experience. So the beliefs that form based on all that experience, growing up Black, growing up Jewish, growing up Muslim, growing up, Christian, where everything is wonderful and happy and nobody tells the truth. It's like whatever the environment is, it gets put into the formation of a self. This is who I am. This is who others are. This is what the world is. So that's the process of accumulating our beliefs and our personality and the way we see the world. And those beliefs operate as lenses we then look through. And so we're always verifying our beliefs because we're looking through them. And they filter out what doesn't align and they let in what does align. So that's the basis of psychology. It's the basis of personality. It's the basis of who we are in the world. So now what happens when you grow up? The beliefs you formed as a child don't work anymore, but they're still there in the subconscious mind. We add lots of beliefs on top of them, but the core is like the roots of a weed. And you can stomp on a weed and hope it goes away, but it doesn't. It just gets pissed and grows back stronger. Or you can cut it off with a lawnmower, but the roots are still there and it will grow back again. But if you pull it out by the roots, then it doesn't grow back. And that's weeding of a garden, and it's also weeding of the mind. So I looked for what worked to clear out those beliefs and structures permanently, rapidly, and completely. And that's how I formed my training, was based on those principles and those techniques that really worked to do that. So in psychology, there's a thing called memory reconsolidation, which is only about 10 or 15 years old. But they used rat studies and saw how memory works. And they said, okay, memories get consolidated through experience. And in order to change them, you have to deconsolidate them, shift them, and put them back together to reconsolidate them. And that's basically what we're doing. I found out about memory reconsolidation 5 years ago. I said, oh, that's what I've been doing for 20 years. Oh, so that's a psychological explanation, and you could look into memory studies and how neurons work and all that. But that's the principle, is we need to go back into the memory banks, change the memory, change the structure, the Lego blocks, change them around, and then suddenly you're a different person because you don't have that belief anymore that's been driving your life.
I was a psychology undergrad. There's a question a lot of coaches ask, like, what is that doing for you now? And that gets at that. But I love the way you named it. In my coaching, I'll name something before, like, I'll suggest it, right? Like, and like what it is. And and how it's relevant to that client, and then, ask them for permission if that's something what they want to do. And so this is great. So, and I love the weeding of the mind, like pulling the weeds out. And that was amazing. Like the way you described that, that was powerful. It was like, get the lawnmower, it grows back. You get, because don't we feel that way, y'all? Where it's like, wait, that's back. That was gone. That was on vacation for a year. That negative thought, how did that come back? Or you have like a friendship breaking up, or you don't get that client, or that client leaves you. There's this post on Instagram that I reposted like last week, and it's like, your business brings up all your traumas, like the trauma of you being left, abandoned, fear of abandonment, your attachment style. I was like, wow, that is so real. Thank you for putting up with my nerdiness and all the topics. But let's go back to the psychedelic. What does that do for the unhooking, if you're familiar with that?
In 20 years doing shamanic practice with a group led by a true shaman. So yes, I've got a lot of experience in that realm, and that informs my training, of course. So there's a lot of people issuing psychedelics to other people right now that are not trained, not trained traditionally, which it took my friend 11 years to become a shaman, 11 years of dedicated practice. But there's a lot of people who said, oh, psychedelics changed me, so I'll help other people change. The problem is that deconsolidates the brain-mind. But if there's no process of reconsolidating, it can either go back the way it was, or it can go wacko crazy because there's no structure holding it anymore. In our process, whenever we deconsolidate, we delete an old belief, we replace it with something life-enhancing. And we don't tell people what to believe. We ask them, what would you prefer to believe? What would enhance your life? What would make you feel wonderful in those situations where you felt terrible before? Because we've all been programmed by other people for far too long. And the only way for a person to develop is to come up with their own set of beliefs that work for them. So without that piece, without the integration piece after psychedelics could be dangerous. And there's a lot of sloppy psychedelic therapy going on. There's also good psychedelic therapy going on where there is an integration process. My wife happens to be a couples therapist. There's a lot of work with people who are going to psychedelic trainings all over the place, and they come back very screwed up because there's no process of integration, and she has to kind of put them back together. So word to the wise, make sure that the person understands these principles and knows how to get you back together in a better way than when you started.
And that's a good point, because I do feel like it's like all the rage right now and everybody's talking. And it's like always having the right trained professionals. And I think there's a lot more risk with this analogy that I'm going to give, but that I'm going to provide. But like, it's like finding coaches that say they're experienced with something and then they're not. And they're like, I'm like, what are you really experienced with besides just telling me it's my fault, or that I have to change my mind without giving me, like, there's like no credentials here. And like, it's like so many people just buy, they buy a laptop, or they're buying psychedelics and they're like, hey, here you go. This was my journey. Do this. And it's like, no. Especially when a lot of people never have done psychedelics. Like, how can you trust that?
That's also true, not just in the psychedelic realm, but in the self-development realm, where someone does a workshop, it magically enhances their life. And then they study how to do that workshop, and they start using that technique for everybody from that point forward. This is the old story of if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Every individual is unique. Every individual has a unique background, a unique mind, a unique personality, and one tool does not serve everyone. That's why we teach 20 different tools and techniques that are all integrated together so that the coach can pick and choose the right tool for the job at the moment with that unique individual. And so if you go to someone who does a process over and over and over again, it's likely that that process worked for them, which is why they're doing it to you.
That's a whole nother topic, folks. The next question that I had, so there have been a couple of workshops I've done, I would say a handful, maybe not just more than a couple, where I'm talking about below the surface, coaching below the surface, and I'll get a question about trauma, I'll answer it, and like coaches sometimes they sound the alarm bells and they're like, "We're not therapists. Like, what do we do? Like, how are you? How dare you?" And I'm like, "No, I know I'm not a therapist." And I've had clients where I've had to tell them to get therapist, or we've had to design what that might look like. And I mean, there's only been one I'd had to directly say, "I think you need a therapist." And this client was going through some very traumatic stuff, and I won't get into it. But usually, I mean, that's the care model that we talk about. That's part of designing alliances, and that's part of what we design. So maybe talk a little bit about like how trauma informed coaching is different from therapy. Because I think when people hear the word trauma, they're like, "Oh no, that needs to be a therapist." And I'm like, no, actually, like if you think that, then you're not really coaching, especially you're not coaching below the surface if you're afraid of that word. So tell me a little bit about how that could be different.
First of all, I call what I do therapeutic coaching because it's somewhere in between therapy and coaching. We are not therapists. We don't do therapy. We do coaching, but we do coaching that influences the past, cleans up the past, and allows the person to move forward without the past being a burden on their back. A coach is a person who helps someone up a mountain. And if that person is carrying a bag full of rocks on their back, you don't help them a lot by saying, "Watch out for that branch. This is the direction you're going. We're going to keep going. Keep going. Yeah, you go." It helps to take the rocks out of their backpack. So that's what we're doing. Trauma is a human experience. And as I said, there's a very wide spectrum from mild trauma, dad didn't give me the toy car I wanted, unmet need, all the way to violent trauma, toxic trauma, the kind that I worked with people who had unbelievable stories of horrendous childhoods with violence, starvation, being locked up. I mean, the worst you can imagine from human beings. But it's all human experience. And traumas in particular lock in beliefs quite easily because when you're traumatized, you are deconsolidated. You're confused, you're in pain, you don't understand what's happening, you're trying to figure it out, you want it to stop, and the brain is basically unconsolidated. It's randomized. And someone can come in and program you at that moment and say, "Don't you ever talk to me like that again." And that goes in so deep, it becomes a core belief. I can't ever talk back. That's going to save me from this trauma so I don't die and I survive. And we're talking about at the level of survival. The brain knows that it wants to survive, and so it will figure out anything it takes to survive. And so my teacher called this trauma teaching, but it's a negative saying because you're programming someone when they're traumatized. And that's evil in my particular viewpoint. So, but even if the parent doesn't say that, or the person who's beating you up doesn't say that, you're coming to your own conclusions because the meaning-making part of the mind, the desire to understand what's happening, will take the experience and figure out something that explains it. So a child who's being beaten by a parent for no apparent reason comes to the conclusion, I must be a bad person. There must be something wrong with me to be treated this way. I'm not getting what I need, which is love, care, and affection. I'm getting this instead. So children make it about themselves. And so these are the core wounds that people carry around their whole life. And then they form strategies around it. Like, I'll just be perfect and then I won't be beaten. Or I will be really smart. And then when I answer questions, he won't tell me I'm stupid. So some of the winningest strategies come out of deep wounds. And those strategies can make you a very successful person. I work with very successful people who have deep core wounds that are still festering inside of them, even though they've got all the money and the toys and the family and everything looks great on the outside. But inside, they're still suffering from those wounds. So therapeutic coaching is using this understanding of the mind and going in and clearing out those experiences, reconsolidating them, and changing them at the core so that they just don't exist anymore. Because the past doesn't exist, but we carry it with us in our memory system. And memories are malleable. They can be changed. They can be changed on purpose. They can be changed by accident. But the memory system is very malleable. It's very plastic. So we work with that through guided imagery and many kinds of techniques that shift the understanding or the experience of what happened, so that it's as if it never happened, or as if something different happened that gave a different explanation. For example, a child who's been wounded by a parent, if someone had come in and stopped the parent from hurting them, picked up the child and said, you're going to be okay, I'm going to take you out of here, and then comes back and says to the parent, if you ever do this to this child again, you're going to have to deal with me. That saves the child from the experience of nobody's here for me. And so we go back and we actually shift memory so that that's what happened in the memory system. And then the person doesn't have to have all the burden of nobody was there for me my whole life. Now there's somebody there for me. Now when they need help, they can ask for help. So that's just a small sample of what can happen when we do this work, is we free the person from those structures that got laid in by trauma. This is not talk therapy. We don't care about the story. People talk about it and they don't get re-traumatized, which is the big fear for most coaches is, oh my God, they're going to be traumatized and I'm going to be responsible. That doesn't happen with our methodology. It's very safe.
So let's think a little bit about, so for the coaches or just people, just everyday people that want to be more trauma informed, what are some common missteps that people can take when talking about trauma? And I think one of the things we talked about is like people they're just not trained, or they don't know enough. And I think, like you said, Lion, you were self-taught. So I think some of this can be self-taught. But what are some other things that people could do, or that missteps they may take? And then we could talk a little bit about how to address those.
Sure. One of the missteps or mistakes that people can make is thinking that trauma is all one thing. Trauma just referred to being beaten badly, mugged, robbed, kidnapped. That was trauma. But as over the last 20 years, we've expanded that definition to include huge traumas to very small traumas. Because a small trauma, as I said, could be you didn't get what you wanted, or someone didn't come when you cried. So thinking that the trauma is one thing is a mistake, and understanding that there's a very wide spectrum and that it all impacts human experience, from the smallest to the largest, and that it's part of our human experience, that we all have some kind of trauma, except for the few people that had a perfect life. So we have to include that. So another one is to be afraid of trauma. First of all, you have to clear your own trauma in order to work with other people's trauma. That's a big part of our training, is people work with each other and clear their own stuff that's in the way so that they're freed up. Because if you work with someone who's traumatized and you haven't checked your own trauma, you haven't cleared it yourself, you're going to get triggered. And then suddenly you're not going to be very good as a coach or a healer or whatever you would do. You're now out of your professional mind and into your traumatized mind. So those are a couple of things that are really important. When you read a book about trauma, but reading a book about trauma doesn't heal your own trauma, and it doesn't help you learn how to work with other people's trauma. There's some great books on trauma out there. I could name a few, but it's sort of like studying psychology and then thinking you're a therapist. There's training involved, there's practice involved, there's mentoring involved. It's a skill, and you only gain a skill by study and practice.
So what are one or two things that people can do to get started with this? Like, is there an easy way to kind of, like, let's say tomorrow someone that's listening to this is in a conversation with a friend that is going through a lot of trauma, or just experienced a traumatic event. What are a couple things that they can do right away?
Well, the first thing I always recommend is do my training, because it's very I can't help it. This is what I do. So take my training, clearbeliefs.com. That will get you to information about the training. But it is a 6-month training. It takes time to really learn all the aspects, practice it yourself, clear your own stuff, and then be able to work with other people through your own intuition. So it's all customized to the particular client that shows up. And all of our techniques are based on the idea that this technique works in certain situations with certain people. And when that person shows up, you now have a tool to use. It's like a handyman who comes to your house and you say, hey, can you fix that squeaky door? Yeah, I have the right tools. Can you change that light bulb? Sure, I can do that. You fix the cement? No, you got to go to a specialist to fix the cement. So we also know our limitations and know who we don't work with. But so that's the first thing. The second thing is just inform yourself in any way you can. There's a thing called experiential therapy, a great guy who shows many different forms of therapy, like you were talking about, that use different technologies. There's so much to learn. It's hard to point them to one place other than my training. And one thing you can ask is, what's underneath that? This is one of our techniques that we teach. It's very simple. You tell me something's going on. Oh, what's underneath that? And you say, tell me more. And I say, and what's underneath that? And what's underneath that? And you keep that up until you find something at the core. And then you need the skill to work with it. But at least you've found what's really going on. I'm having a fight with my wife. What's underneath that? She keeps yelling at me. What's underneath that? Well, it reminds me of my mom. What's underneath that? My mom was really harsh on me. It didn't. And what's underneath that? Well, I was kind of a brat. So what's underneath that? Now you're diving down, as you said, underneath, going deeper in coaching from just the surfacey level.
Sometimes it's just getting the person out of that, for their brain out of fight or flight mode, even if it's like sitting and breathing with them, or that's one of the things I like to do, is just sit and breathe with someone and just be grounded, like feel your feet on the ground, like those types of things, like everything, just because it's like you can get really wound up, right? And it's like, especially if something's happening. Yeah, and we've had some things like that have happened in Chicago, that's like, oh, how would I help someone, like, if I saw this, like, instead of being a bystander. And so how people can get a hold of you, Lion?
Well, the best places are my personal website, which is liongoodman.com, and the training site, which is clearbeliefs.com. Those will get you pretty much all the information you want, probably more information than you want. The article about my being shot is called A Shot in the Light, and it's under the articles tab on my personal website.
Well, thank you so much, Lion, for joining us. So folks, thank you for joining us. And again, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else, and we will see you next time.